Thank you, Madam Chair, and I want to thank our witnesses for appearing here today. When I see patients as a physician, it's my first duty to make the proper diagnosis. Once I understand the cause of the medical problem, then I can come up with a medical plan. The nature of the problem determines the nature of the solution. If you misdiagnose the problem, your solution is going to be wrong, or maybe even worse. There's no doubt that there's a crisis in Cuba. The country is impoverished, it's ruled by a tyrannical and corrupt regime. Its people are forced to endure egregious violations of human rights, and political prisoners are detained, tortured, and killed. Everyone can agree on this. The million-dollar question, however, is who's at fault? The far left claim that this is a result of the U.S. embargo on the country, and that the Trump-era policy of maximum pressure on the Cuban people is to blame. But those making these wild assertions fail to ask why these policies were implemented in the first place. Cuba has suffered under a communist rule for 60 years, with a vast majority of the economy owned or controlled by the regime. Now more than ever, the Cuban regime is brutally repressing and punishing its civil society and violating the basic human rights of its citizens. Activists, protesters, and even bystanders are unjustly imprisoned and subject to torture and inhumane treatment that the Cuban regime dispenses upon its dissidents. The regime even engages in state-sponsored human trafficking, enriching itself of the profits of forced labor. Cuba is not impoverished because the United States refuses to do business with them. Russia, China, Venezuela, and several other less than reputable countries happily conduct business with the Cuban regime. Rather, the country is impoverished because the regime, at every turn, enriches itself at the people's expense, and they viciously beat down anyone who questions their policies. That is communism, plain and simple, whether it's the former Soviet Union, the CCP, or the Cuban regime. Opening the United States to Cuba will not enrich the country. The corrupt government will not spontaneously root out corruption and redistribute the wealth back to the people. It will not release the thousands of political prisoners it is locked up, and it will certainly not embrace the free market principles required to do business with the United States. The Cuban military is embedded in nearly every single business, so the concept of a private sector is virtually non-existent in the country. The only outcome to the Biden administration easing pressure off the country is that the brutal Cuban regime will further gorge itself on the profits provided by American businesses, and we will be complicit. The Cuban government, through its military, is metastasizing throughout Latin America. Anything that puts another dollar into the hands of the Cuban government will increase the export of that authoritarianism. Venezuela, Colombia, Bolivia, etc., etc. Doing so, putting money into the hands of this authoritarian regime, is almost as stupid as easing sanctions on Iran or trading $6 billion for 5 hostages. Now is not the time for us to ease up. Now is the time for the United States to hold strong in its steadfast commitment to ensure that the Western Hemisphere is truly free and prosperous. This administration's ceaseless flirting with opening ties to Cuba will remove the only chance that the Cuban citizens have for freedom. It is no small thing for the Cuban regime to endure an embargo from the United States, even with China and Russia as economic partners. If we remove the only leverage that we have to push for reform, then the Cuban regime will have no reason to treat its people with dignity and respect. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and I yield.